So wonderful to see you all. Now, I am comfortable with a classroom type setting here, and because of the pandemic, I've become much more familiar with Zoom than I ever wanted to be, and remote learning than ever wanted to be. But I'm comfortable with that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show a couple slides. We'll have a little bit of conversation, and while I'm talking, if you have a question, feel free to raise your hand. Feel free to include questions or comments in the chat. If you've got some questions that are lingering from even last night's conversation with Shane, we can discuss any and all of that. It's all on the table. What I want to do, though, is introduce you to this theme that I'm talking about here. You know, I call it the racial script, unreading the racial script. Now, what I mean by the racial script is the common understanding of human difference that we all believe ourselves to be living. There are common understandings about what racism is, and I don't make a distinction between racism and white supremacy. They're both referring to the same phenomenon. Racism is white supremacy, and white supremacy is racism. What that does is it should interrupt common misunderstandings about what racism is. When we understand racism to be connected to affect, feelings about racial groups different than ourselves, we misdiagnose the problem, and you cannot address something, an illness, if we were to use that language, with an improper diagnosis. You cannot fix stomach cancer with Pepto-Bismol. You know, you cannot fix a gaping wound with a cough drop. You got to diagnose the problem correctly. So to get at this, what I want to do is offer us some clarification of terms. Oh, who's the host here today?
I'm a co-host, Reggie, if you need any help.
I need to be able to share my screen.
Oh, sure. Let me make you a host.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Okay. So a couple of months ago, I wrote an article for Christian Century after George Floyd was murdered. That week that he was murdered, I sat down at my laptop to just yell on the screen. And instead, what I found myself doing was what I wanted to do with you today is just define some terms. I ended up being pedagogical, just teaching. To address the problem that we are facing, to address that problem in that moment, we have to be able to realize what just happened. What are we looking at in society? When we often use words interchangeably, what I'm going to be talking to you about today is xenophobia, prejudice, and white supremacy. We will oftentimes use those words interchangeably, but they don't mean the same thing. And to address what you're, to get at what you're wanting to describe, to highlight, you got to know what you're talking about. We have to do that. And another, by way of preliminary, oh no, I'm going to leave that till we get to that word. So this tweet, people wanted me to interact with him publicly because he has also written a book on Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Jesus was white. Did he have white privilege? Even though he was entirely without sin, is the United Methodist Church covering that? Because the United Methodist Church was pushing for some interaction with racism, with Robin DiAngelo, a white woman who wrote a race book. Jesus was white. This is just default for Mitaki. Now, he's pretty egregious. He's an extreme, but he's also naming something that's really commonly understood too. Jesus was white and he's without sin. So therefore, being white is not a sin. This is basically this is the logic. Is Jesus white? Really? What's going on? What is happening here? I showed you this morning. This concept, this ideal. White is recent in world history. That's important to recognize. White is recent. It's not as old as Metaxas makes it out to be, or as we understand it to be. In order for there to be white, there has to be other things that are missing what is present in this ideal thing. So other racial derivations are the absence. They're missing something that's present within this ideal figure. In other words, James Baldwin, who said, he said in a piece of popular writing, "I am not your Negro. You need the Negro in order to see yourself. The Negro is a figment of your imagination, created to make yourself legible." What does that mean? It is the absence of something that is present within the fully human ones. So in other words, you don't know smart or beautiful without dumb and ugly. That's all invented. Xenophobia. Now going from there, we're going to come back to that template. Xenophobia is a word that's often used to in this common moment that we have, where where isms and phobias have been platformed from the highest office in the land. To call someone a xenophobe is to say what to them? Xenophobia, the textbook definition of xenophobia, is fear and hatred of strangers or foreigners or anything strange and foreign. An intense or irrational dislike or fear of people from other countries or strangers. Fear or contempt for what is foreign, especially strangers and people from countries or different culture. It is a dislike of strangers. And contrast that, and this is really what white is, contrast. But in defining this word, contrast it with xenophilia, the love of strangers or foreigners or anything strange. Xenophobia is the opposite of that. No aliens. Prejudice is not xenophobia. Xenophobia is not white supremacy. Prejudice is not white supremacy, but it often can include prejudice. In fact, it does. Prejudice, the definition of it is in the word itself: a preconceived judgment or opinion, an adverse opinion or leaning formed without just grounds before sufficient knowledge. Uninformed opinion of a person or group of people. An uninformed opinion, not by actual knowledge of others. I have knowledge of them that has been created by me or my group that is not relative, or I should say, does not relate to their actual person. I have prejudged them. We're all guilty of this. Anybody can be xenophobic. Anybody can be prejudiced. But prejudice and xenophobia are not racism. This kid is a depiction of that. I bet she's a cheerleader and he's obviously a jock. Black kids are always listening to rap. You don't know what this kid is listening to. You have no idea if this guy can catch a ball or anything, or she is. You have no idea. It's just prejudged them. Howard Thurman, in his book Jesus and the Disinherited, give a good definition, a helpful definition, I should say, ingredients of prejudice. His textbook, his very well-known classic, Jesus and the Disinherited, that Martin Luther King Jr. was said to carry around with him often or all the time, a copy of it. It's like a Bible for the civil rights movement. He says in a chapter there on hatred, a chapter devoted to hatred, he says that hatred begins with contact without fellowship. We see them all the time. They do our laundry. They mow our lawns. They do the dishes. We have contact with them constantly, but no fellowship. Leads to unsympathetic understanding. I know how they are. You see them all the time. You know how they are. Generating ill will. Don't leave your children with them. Don't let them change your lock without watching them. Don't leave your belongings out. Make sure you have more than one person around when you see them, because you know how they are, because you see them all the time. And you're sharing that within your community of fellowship. That's prejudice. Prejudice, the way I'm describing prejudice is really it's closely related to bigotry, which is just ill will. Prejudice can also be, boy, they're the best dancers. They all can dance. Or, boy, they're really all good at math. You have these types that are part of prejudice. Prejudice is not white supremacy, but white supremacy often includes prejudice. But what is racism? What is racism? Merriam-Webster says the belief that race is the primary determinant of human traits and capacities, and that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race. The problem here, I'm going to go back. The problem here is that it takes race as a given. It enters its definition in a moment when race has already done its work. That it does exist. Now, I would say race is a political reality, but definitely not a biological one. The belief in an inherent superiority of a particular race doesn't tell you what's really going on. Racism is the manufacture and the maintenance of systems and structures for whites only. That is what racism is. The invention of human difference that we know today as race comes online as the argument for an ascendant type. White. That is white supremacy. That is racism. It's important to emphasize this again. White has not always existed. Begins with Europeanus from Linnaeus, or at least some of it does. The naming of it does. With Europeanus, with Linnaeus. Later in the same century, Johann Friedrich Blumenbach identifies the Caucasus as the location for the derivation of this demographic of people in the world because of the inherent beauty of its inhabitants. So they become Caucasian with Blumenbach. And at the same time, they're also buying and selling in African flesh, and they have to give an account for their engagement with Africans in this way. We are moral people. We want to tell you why we're doing what we're doing. We will make up a reason for it. So for hundreds of years, they develop a description of the Negro as a reason for their dependence on Europeans. And white becomes a political, legal status in the United States. Owning property, and these property are people. And they manufacture systems, and they maintain them for whites only. That's what white supremacy is. We are its inheritors. We are living in that today. So what you see before you in this iceberg, the way we usually talk about racism is the impact that it has on people of color within society. They're treated poorly. Look at how awful they have it. Oh my gosh, this is terrible. And oh, that person said the N-word, racist. Or this person over here has a Confederate sign outside their house, racist. It's what happens to people of color in an overtly racist society. But as you know, with an iceberg, that's not the iceberg. That's the tip of the iceberg. That is the secondary effect. The whole thing is actually about what you don't see. It's the longing, the manufacture and the maintenance of systems and structures for whites only. This is a white country. Speak English. Why are we letting in all of these immigrants from S-hole countries? We need more from Norway, the white countries. It's longing. And you tap into the longing that people are afraid to say out loud because of what it may how they might be described. And you give that longing a platform. You have them no matter what you do or say. So long as you give voice to those longings. But what needs to happen is you have to undo that figure, the template, as an actual figure. He's not real. So let me stop there. I can go on further about this as I possibly could, but I want to make sure I'm watching the time. How much time do we have, by the way? I'm going to stop sharing. I can go back into these slides. I have some other pictures that I could show. We can also talk. What time are we done here? I have 1:14 Chicago time.
Reggie, we'll be done here at 11:50 West Coast, so that will be
1:50.
1:50 East Coast.
Okay, good. So good. We've got some time for some dialogue now. I've got some other slides that I could show if necessary, but let's stop and have some conversation. What are you hearing that's new? What are you hearing that you're familiar with? What are you not understanding?
One easy thing to mention as new to me was what you showed us about Linnaeus and categorization of human types. I had never seen that before.
Yeah, so interestingly about Linnaeus is he coins the term Homo sapien. It did not exist before Natural Systems that he wrote in the 18th century. His book, Natural Systems. That Homo sapiens is a term that is derived from his taxonomy, classifying human types and telling you about their character and so forth. And we are still living with those those traits that he says are present within the categories of Homo sapien.
Hey, my name's
Hi,
Emily.
Emily.
Hi. So, I mean, I just really appreciate hearing from you speaking on these issues. And, you know, hopefully you're going to still talk about it, but you left us with a question. That's my hugest question is how do we undo the template? I mean, it's so ingrained and I'm guilty of that too. Sometimes I wish I could just change the color of my skin, but like you said earlier, benevolency is not going to cure it. And I think we think that is what we can do. So, I mean, I don't know how to change my sister's mind on this issue. You know, I don't know how to, yeah, it's very deep.
Yeah, it is. So here's what I'm not saying that we should do. We should not be concerned with changing anything related to our bodies or our person in that respect. You are who you are, but the issue that we are addressing is the information attached to how you read your body. What it means to be a part of the demographic that you represent physically, aesthetically. The history of information that is assigned to understanding you when we see you and hear you talk. That's what we are addressing. When the Africans left the slaving ports, I talked about this at Westmont last year sometime. I'd taken a class to Ghana of master students from my seminary. We had an amazing time It was the second time that I'd been there, to Ghana, third time that I've been to the West Coast and to slaving ports. But there's spots in the dungeons, the slaving ports. These are places where kidnapped and ambushed Africans were marched, and they were held 3 months at minimum, oftentimes for a very long time, in the dark, in feces, urine, menstrual cycle, decaying flesh. It's awful. No place to lay down that's not just unimaginable. And then they're loaded onto boats for what is unquestionably the worst part of being changed from an Ashanti, a Fanti, Aquapon, these tribal people, into Negro in the Western world. So known by their land, by their traditions, by their community, by their family and their friends, their tribal leaders and so forth, and they become Negro. Okay. Their identity is placed on their skin, and they're described according to stuff like Linnaeus and Blumenbach. A complete transformation of being. In the same moment that they leave that door of no return, the people who are buying and selling them are making moral sense of what they're doing. We do want to justify ourselves. We seek to make sense of what we do and why we do what we're doing. You are the inheritors of their logic. We live in a land that is saturated with the moral reasons for buying and selling Black people, owning Black people. The question for us, then, because this is just the default way of knowing the world after centuries, is how to wake from that, how to shake off the coils. It's, in a sense, and this is why I call it the racial script. Each of us are handed at birth a role to play in this narrative. Your role is given to you without merit or consent. You've not auditioned for it. You are simply born into that body and given this script. Beautiful, intelligent, moral, capable, future president, leader, so forth. It is given to you as the potential for your future based on your body and this narrative that predates you. I didn't finish the story that I started earlier, and I'm just realizing that the backyard swimming pool that I said in the plenary. It's fun to turn and face the tide of water. Okay. We live in a world where everything for centuries has been speaking in a direction about white ascendancy. All outlets, education being a primary one, religion, the distribution of goods and services, all of it, one direction about white ascendancy. To face that tide of information is to be bowled over by its strength if you try to do it alone. You can't face it by yourself. You need people who are turning to face it with you. You're not going to convince your sister or your parents by yourself. It's not going to happen. It's not, you're, the lib, the snowflake lib, trying to sell out your country. The Black Lives Matter people who hate families. They're white people. But to face the tide, you need allies. We need each other. it's also helpful to recognize that large sections of what goes by Christianity in this world were chaplains to that imperial project of selling and buying Black people. It was just chaplaincy to it. And then there are also Christians who understood that all of God's children deserve love and care and respect. In the beauty of the lilies, Christ was born across the sea with the beauty in his bosom that transfigures you and me. As he died to make men holy, let us live to make men free. God's truth is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. This is abolitionist Christianity. The civil rights movement was a modern iteration of abolitionist Christianity. And interestingly, he used technology. King's movement in the bus boycott had technology. Today, there's so much technology, we're living in outrage fatigue. You're seeing it all over the place, and it's now adjusting again. I talked too long in response to that question, sorry.
Reggie, can I ask, this is quite the project we're talking about here, right? Like a turning of the cultural tide, and not just cultural, but an entire system of how everything works, really. Have you seen in your studies a country that's done this well? Or is this kind of an unprecedented project in human history? I mean, I think of even what South Africa has done, but have they changed and dismantled truly white supremacy, or have they just owned up to the past better than the United States? And they're still figuring out the whole project they have to do now too. Have you found a model in human history that can help us with this?
Well, so South Africa's move to abolish apartheid happened in the 90s. So it's a very recent, I should say, model to take a look at. And what they did with they initiated this Truth and Reconciliation Commission that was meant to hold, it should have, held people accountable to the crimes committed during the apartheid regime, murders, lots of murders, just a brutal, beastly, brutal regime, not unlike the United States. It's interesting to note that when the Nazis put together the Nazi regime and the Nuremberg laws that were introduced at Nuremberg in 1935 for a racial society, they had studied the United States. When the apartheid regime put together apartheid, South African apartheid, at Stellenbosch in South Africa, they had studied Nazi Germany and the United States. They're rehearsing these concepts that I'm telling you about right now, about ascendancy and type. Germany has made some moves to outlaw certain kinds of speech and gestures. You will not find statues to Nazis or buildings or schools and so forth named after Nazis in Germany. You're not going to find it. Here it's heritage. You know, in South Africa, some of the younger generation are very upset about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission because all of the murderers got off. But Mandela was arguing that reconciliation must be had in this way. So it's the struggle here is not to find, though, it's not to find a government that's doing something other than what the government was set up to do in its origins, is to recognize this is a white space, or even the Constitution, but to find within this a body of believers. You know, people. And this is my work. I mean, as a Christian ethicist, I'm speaking to people who are serving, who believe themselves to be serving Christ. And what does that mean in a place in a racialized world? it's working to undo this system and this structure. And I find churches that are doing this. I certainly will find, you find churches and communities that are doing this. They take what we understand as the mission of the church to be justice. And justice in this or that issue means paying attention to these things in this way. Justice in a racialized society means paying attention to the way our understanding of human being is structured, such that goods and services in society are distributed to whites only. And churches working to undo that, or work in certain kinds of ways, organizing voting, you know, being engaged politically. I don't know, DJ, if that answered your question very well. I would say it this way: no, I haven't seen anywhere in the Western world where people are addressing this thing in a very proactive and totalizing way. I have seen places in the West where there are gestures to recognize the evil of the past. Most specifically, Germany, after the Nazi regime.
Thanks,
They stand
Reggie.
out.
Yeah.
I got to tell you one more story about Germany. Two quick ones. Friend of mine, I got a chance to study with someone in Jerusalem at an institute that trains people for trains pastors. I'm sorry, not pastors, rabbis. And one of the lecturers there her family survived Auschwitz. A mom survived Auschwitz. She got courage to go and visit Germany. And when she was heading into train station, she passed under a sign that said, "You have freedom of mobility. You can move about the country freely." There was a time in our not so distant past when there are a lot of people who were not capable of moving so freely. You must not forget them. And it was the acknowledgement of that awful that moved her to tears. She lives in Israel. She's Jewish. She's moved to tears by seeing the recognition of that past humanity in a public space. I'll stop with that one. I had another one, but I'll stop with that one. Yvonne, I see your hand.
Hi. So
Hi.
I've been listening to this very interesting conversations. My history is a little different from some people. I have an adopted son who is Black and Irish. I have a Korean daughter. My parents were through World War II, and my father worked in the Dutch underground. I immigrated over. I've experienced prejudice on many different levels because of my past. When I came to America, no one wanted anything to do with me because I didn't speak English. And then as I adopted my son, I was ostracized by Black people and ostracized by white people. My son and I have been having discussion about Black Lives Matter, and I mentioned it to other people. My frustration is the people who come up to me and say, well, all lives matter. And that's true, all lives matter. But how do I answer people? I mean, I raised my son pretty much white, but I also told him, walk away. And when people look at you because of your skin color, he's been shot at, he's been chased at, he's been shot. I said always to him, yes, your skin color matters to other people, but not to me or to the people that matter. Walk when you can, but fight with everything you can if you're put up against the wall. Was that the right thing to do? He's always been able to just move forward and be in a community that was mostly white and stand up for himself and not be bitter. He doesn't carry a chip on his shoulder. I just don't know always how to answer people. Then they fight back against me and saying, yeah, but everybody matters. Everybody in my family matters. What do I say to people? How do we get beyond this fact that just because his skin is brown, as he pointed out to me one day, he said, somebody called me Black, but I'm brown. I don't understand. And I had to go through the whole thing about race, is what you talked about. I actually had to show him pictures of different people and ask him, who would you identify with? And that's part of the problem. But I'm just not always sure how to answer people.
Sure. What language were you speaking when you came?
Dutch.
Oh,
My
nice.
father
Yeah, it's another
My
one.
uncle was the head of Dutch Underground in Southern Holland during World War II.
Sure. Yeah, there's a lot going on. The Dutch were major players in the slave trade. There was also a lot going on there otherwise too. I would say this. When people say skin color doesn't matter, what they mean is it's not a knock against you. Meaning I don't look down on you because of your skin color, or your skin color is not bad. I certainly, it's important to recognize it matters, and I would want. Oh, did you hear me? Did I go out?
You did for a second. It's okay.
Okay. What did you last hear me say?
Something about that the skin color matters.
Okay, let me say this. Yeah, let me say it this way. Usually when people are saying your skin color doesn't matter, what they mean is it's not a knock against you, or you're not less than human because of your skin color, or some derivation of that. It would be important to recognize that beauty comes in lots of shades, and that you do see his skin color, and that society would have us do by the template. For young Black boys to be told that Brad and Chad are the image of beauty, and for young Black girls to be told that Jennifer and Karen are the image of beauty. You don't recognize beauty in your body, so you do see. I do see that beautiful melanin. I would make sure that you recognize that, not that his body is invisible. And I don't have much by way of argument to people who offer a rebuttal to Black Lives Matter. It's a rebuttal. It is simply a rebuttal. Blessed are the poor in spirit. No, Jesus, blessed are all lives. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Jesus, God isn't exclusive. Blessed is everybody. You can't say all lives matter if you refuse to recognize that Black lives matter. Not even worth not an argument. It's interesting how it provokes people to offer a rebuttal. That is just the inherent response in a society that has this cosmic battle being played out on Black flesh between good and evil. Our bodies are the site of that struggle. Black is the intrinsically, inherently evil. And to value that Black body is to take up the side of the enemy. And it's not something that you think of. It's just there. There are other questions here. I see. I'm going to try and answer quicker. Sorry. Does somebody else have a question that I don't see in the chat? I know there were other questions.
Dr. Rhymes maybe had a hand up earlier. Dr.
Yeah. Go ahead. Dr. Rhymes, you want to just say?
Yeah, I wanted to say something when we were talking about Germany. I had the occasion to visit Germany in the Holocaust monuments. And the German people have just gone overboard in terms of how they are educated their children about the events of the past so as not to have these occur again in the future. They bring the children to the site, they talk about what happened, and they talk about what can and should be. And in here, us, I'm an educator, by the way, us, we tend to get really upset when something about Black history, the history of slavery, and all the things that have occurred here is even talked about being implemented in the schools. So we are a long, long, long way, DJ, from where you're talking about. That was
So far from it. Yeah, that's a very good observation, by the way, very astute observation. You think about what's been happening recently, the push to kick critical race theory out of education, out of public spaces, for one. The language about slaves as imported or imported workers or something along those lines. Not imported, but immigrant workers. Completely whitewash the entirety of that. That's not the same. Are you talking about the Holocaust memorial with the blocks that? Yeah, yeah. That's just above the museum.
They have erected a wailing wall, and if you visited, and they wail 24/7. They have women there wailing 24/7. It's the saddest place I've been, but it is also uplifting in that you see a people who say we've committed these atrocities and now we need to do something and educate future generations so this never happens again.
Yeah, it's a part of their active memory, but it's not. That's not to say that Germany does not have its own significant problems of neo-Nazism. I've had the privilege of speaking to sections of churches there who are trying to address this, specifically in East Germany, the former Soviet bloc. They have their problem of neo-Nazism, but the governmental response is to not sweep this under the rug, not to valorize it. And there are several different kind of memorials around the country around to this.
If I may, here I wonder what your response to this is. That here there are churches, there are many churches who are addressing this, trying to address this issue, and like this conference bringing these things to fore. But there are also churches where people, because the congregation, they're afraid that the congregation, they'll get feedback or flack from the congregation. They are afraid to speak out the minister. And
True.
so,
yeah.
So how do you deal with that?
Bravery. It's really, I mean, to put it plainly, that is a real issue, and it takes some boldness on the part of the pastor and the pastoral staff. I did several week series with an Episcopalian church that partnered with an Episcopalian seminary here in the Chicagoland over the summer. That pastor, there was a few Episcopalian churches. Two of them specific, and really one in particular, was under constant threat for bringing up this conversation. And I could see it in his face when the time would come we were doing once a month. After the first two, we had like four after that. After the first two, he was steeling himself for the next one. And what kind of response he was getting from his congregation. He was a courageous white pastor to do that. It would mean, first of all, for the pastor to be convicted, or to be convinced that this is a Christian problem. And what kind of response should Christians have to the call of God to remove obstacles that prevent our connecting after the fall, the brokenness between humankind and God, between humankind and humankind, between humankind and creation? What is the call of reconciliation upon your life? And I don't mean, I usually don't use reconciliation because it's so convoluted unless you're dealing with the template issue here, the template, undoing the white template. You can't have reconciliation when white is still ascendant. So there are others. We got a few minutes left. Go ahead, DJ.
Yeah, if I can continue this conversation a little bit, Reggie, I think something possibly that a lot of us here feel, at least those of us who are tuning in from the Santa Barbara area, is something I hear a lot in my place, I work on a church staff. Something I hear a lot is, why are we talking about Black and white race issues when we live not only on the West Coast, but in a town with a population no more than 2% Black? Why does this matter to us? Why does this matter to churches? Why aren't we talking about ethnic groups that actually live here, is something we hear. How can you relate what you're talking about to our context here, perhaps?
Because remember, it's not about the secondary effect. It's not about how the people of color are treated in a racist environment. Racism is the manufacturing and maintenance of systems and structures for whites only. How has Santa Barbara arranged itself in that way? How does Santa Barbara see white as ascendant? It's, you don't need people of color. They, in fact, exist in your mind as a white person, even when they're in front of you. That's the problem. This is the problem. The template is the problem. That is the singular problem, and it is another way of saying this, and to use a little bit of jargon. It's the Western world project of the human. Okay, in the West, the project of the human being is casts an archetype, a template around which to arrange human difference. Even if you had a lot of Black people there, you had a lot of Mexican people there, you had a lot of different Asian groups there, you're dealing with the very same problem that you have without them. It's the imagination of them that you need to bolster the archetype as the central figure of human being, the one who is the one to whom human being refers to fully. That's the problem. That's the problem.
Could I ask about, I was really interested in the map you put up earlier showing latitudes and the effect on the, I guess on the template or on Linnaeus, but why, how come Black people enslaved other Black people? What was the original motive in that? Of course.
Yeah. This is an important question. This is important to know. And here's the thing: for Black people to go back to visit the African continent, it is disturbing to learn that Africans were a core component of the slave trade. The Ero and Oyo Empire, for example, and in modern day Nigeria and other parts of the sub-Saharan continent made their living on raiding villages of mostly people who weren't considered royalty, but unprotected farming groups were captured by the Fawn dynasty in what's today Benin and so forth. Zora Neale Hurston's last book, Barracoon is the name of it, is the first, it's an account of one of the last enslaved Africans from the continent. She got an interview with this man. You can hear how the trade happened by just reading his narrative of it. The Fawn dynasty sacking his village and selling him to Europeans. What's important to recognize there, while they made their living in doing that, the Europeans, in effect, kicked off an arms race on that continent, buying and selling people with guns and bullets, also liquor and so forth. They kicked that off there. And then they brought those Africans into a new space where we currently live, where we all live, and an ideology was created as an apologetic for that, to describe it. That's what affects us today. Now, while they made their living doing that, it's a very different substance than what exists here today. We can talk about the wake of slave trade on the African continent and the wake of the slave trade in the West. In Africa, for example, in Ghana, you are not permitted to speak about whether or not someone was once a slave. You don't have the existence of what we would describe as race on that continent. The residual from that slave trade has been wiped out within the heritage of the people who are there now. But today in the West, you have white supremacy that's birthed from the process of that slave trade. It's a very different manifestation now. The residual of it is what we are living with now. The whole process has arranged different existences on the continent and in the Western world.
Reggie, I just wanted to give you a heads up that our time is closing. Is there something
we have a minute left, I see.
So if you wanted to end with anything specific or had forgotten or had something you wanted
well, I would say this. I would say this. When the reason for this conversation, it's helpful for multiple reasons. One, and many people have become more aware of how significant this problem is now. After the last administration and the summer, people have become much more aware of it. It's important for Christians to recognize that this is not kind of an and one. That you can address this, or you can have somebody to address this. In your community or so forth, but it's not the goal of the gospel. This is a problem to not see this as core to the mission of the church. Until we recognize that things like hospitality are core to your eternal salvation, that I was hungry and you gave me something to eat is not an option. We find ourselves within the traditions of Christianity that could, I meant to tell the story earlier, exist on the top of the slave dungeon, worshiping, while people are suffering in chains to be sold as property. I'll just stop there. We need to see this as core to the mission of the church and figure out how to address this. Susan, I see your hand. Okay. I'm sorry. I feel like I was a bit long-winded. I know I was speaking kind of quickly here at the end. God bless you, sisters and brothers.
Reggie,
yeah.
Before we go, just a quick announcement. First of all, everyone, if we just want to say thank you to Reggie for this workshop, give him a thumbs up, either on the screen or a hand, whatever it might be. It's outstanding. Thank you so much for your work. Thank you for your study, and thank you for your persistence. And